If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe.
Everything has to begin somewhere, with something. August 2020 saw the 100th anniversary of the coming together of certain streams, musical, technological, commercial and cultural, in an event, the making of a record that turned chaos into cosmos and, for better or for worse, gave us the modern record industry and mass popular music. And it happened on August 10th, 1920 on West 45th Street in New York City. And the event that occasioned the moment was Mamie Smith recording a song called Crazy Blues, which was no less than the first record ever made by an African-American singer, written by an African-American composer, in the African-American musical idiom, performed by African-American musicians, with the intent of being marketed towards primarily urban African-American audiences and 1920s style white hipsters. What it did was not only introduce both the rich tradition of black music to a larger audience, but also open the door for its becoming the dominant influence on popular music over the next 100 years and, frankly, for the foreseeable future. So, as old Carl Sagan said in the intro, we have our apple pie. But how did we invent the universe? After a long period of development, the first working phonograph arrived in 1877. Edison's famous Mary Had a Little Lamb demonstrator. Of course, sound quality was terrible, and after a fitful attempt to fix the issues, Edison gave up and went off to invent the light bulb instead. After a long period of refinement, much of it done by an offshoot of Alexander Graham Bell's labs, some of the issues had been resolved, largely by the use of a hardened wax cylinder and grooves that ran side to side, not up and down as Edison had done. Originally, they were envisaged as dictation machines or talking letters, but by 1885, phono lounges had popped up at tourist resorts and fun fairs where listeners could pay per selection for current pop song or comedy routines, much as they do these days on Spotify, performed largely by whatever talent could be sourced to make the recordings, largely as they do today on Bandcamp. The first hit recordings, such that people sought out to purchase them, were pretty much what you'd expect for the early 1890s, Sweet Adeline or Hello My Baby. By 1894, a fellow called Emil Berliner developed flat shellac discs. Berliner was a habitual and prolific inventor who dabbled in just about every emerging technology in the era. By 1900, the first artist to have regular hit records was the band leader John Philip Sousa, he of the Monty Python theme fame, who, despite despising recorded music and saying so at every opportunity and very rarely conducting his own orchestra at recording sessions, sold substantial enough numbers of copies for them to still be quite easily located 100 years later in second-hand stores. The most notable thing about these records is their volume and clarity, even when played on contemporary machines. Wax cylinders, which originally wore out after about 20 plays, competed with shellac discs until World War I. Surprisingly, they were still manufactured until 1929, before the RIAA finally killed them off in the early 1940s. The first and fatal nail in their coffin, however, was a record from 1895 by George Washington Johnson called The Laughing Song, which became a runaway hit. Back then, every wax cylinder was a master recording, so Johnson would have to sit in front of 7 acoustic horns and sing the song over and over again, each take producing 3 or 4 usable cylinders. As Johnson was a pretty well-known star of African-American theatre, the Edison Company could hardly hire a ringer to sing the song, so he had to sing it over 10,000 times to keep up with demand, which was good for him because the one-off payments he got from making the record supplemented his income substantially. Performers in those days generally earned no royalties. By 1904, though, Enrico Caruso was earning an unthinkable $4,000 a side and getting a 40-cent royalty. Johnson had a similar-sized hit with a song whose title I can't say if I want YouTube not to ban me again. As shellac discs came in, titles such as Harry Macdonagh's The Holy City or Len Spencer's A Hot Time in the Old Town may have even pushed on to sell around the 100,000 mark. So, given the potential of records to sell this many copies, the concept of mastering had to be addressed. That was what in turn drove the development of hard shellac discs. There were 3 big record labels in the early days of the industries: Edison, who stuck doggedly to making cylinders, Victor, who made only flat discs, and Columbia, the third of the early big 3, made both formats. All 3 companies made their own record players, and the formats were not interchangeable. So you could only play Victor records on Victor machines. You could only play Columbia records on Columbia machines, similarly for Edison. By 1901, when flat discs started to become widely available, record player sales took off. Before World War I, players became available for less than $40, which was seen as the crucial price point. Record sales went from about 4 million a year in 1900 to 30 million a year by 1910 and stayed high during World War I. In 1902, Enrico Caruso's recording of Vesti la Juba from Pagliacci started its journey to becoming the first million seller, even if it did take 7 years and 2 re-recordings to do it. Despite this boon, records were barely 10% of the total music market, which was still dominated at the time by sheet music. Recordings of popular songs usually weren't made until after the sheet music sales tailed off. But by the early 20s, musicians were learning to play songs by listening to records, so sheet music sales started their slow decline to irrelevance by 1960. Another boost to record sales came in 1910 when, after years of being seen as a promotional souvenir products for stage shows, a record called Has Anyone Here Seen Kelly by Broadway singer Nora Bayes became a big seller despite the show it was supposed to promote being a flop. Records were now an outlet for popular songs outside of stage shows, which gave birth to the idea of the independent songwriter. Finally, the most compelling argument to drive forward the record industry came when entrepreneurial types saw that recent develops in technology made startup in the industry easier, and the phenomenal profits were there to be made. It cost roughly 20 cents to make a record. That included a one-off payment to the artist, unless you were Caruso, who got $4,000 aside. Licensing the music and retailers got 15% of the take. That is, if you used an independent retailer. A lot of independent labels were owned by furniture or musical instrument chains that sold record players. So there was no retail overhead or distribution cost, and you just made your records to suit the format of whatever player you sold. Records were priced at between 85 cents and $1.25, so at the very worst, you got about 60 cents a record. So if you sold 5,000 copies, that could mean around $100,000 in profit in today's money with a fast turnaround. So America got to doing what it does best, business. Once the Gennett Record Company won its lawsuit against Victor in 1919 to be able to manufacture discs which could be played on Victrola record players, which by World War I had become the dominant manufacturer of such players, there was a proliferation of independent labels which continued until the Depression. What drove these independent labels was jazz. By the time World War I came around, jazz, as it was called then, began its journey out of the Fourth Ward and up to Mississippi, to Memphis, St. Louis, and ultimately Davenport, Illinois, before going to where the money was. Chicago first, and that was the hotbed of jazz at the start of the Jazz Age, then much later New York. Joe Oliver had visited New York with the vaudeville troupe in both 1915 and 1917, but the music was seen as merely novelty music. Freddie Capard, Buddy Bolden's successor and Joe Oliver's predecessor as King of New Orleans trumpets, was courted by Victor but dropped when he wanted whatever Caruso got. A group of white musicians billing itself as the original Dixieland Jazz Band came in 1917 to record for Victor and were tossed out of the studio for being too loud. 4 days later they were invited back and, in recording Tiger Rag and Livery Stable Blues, made the first jazz records. But after the ODJB soon left New York for Europe, the town was a fallow field for jazz for many years, until the Harlem Renaissance and Mayor Jimmy Walker's famous Blind Eye to Speakeasies finally gave New York at first parity and then by 1930 supremacy over Chicago. But thankfully there was an outlier. Okeh Records, founded in 1918, had its A&R division headed by one of the greatest talent scouts and producers in history, Ralph Peer. Critical in the development of the blues, jazz, and country music, it was he, working with a songwriter and arranger called Perry Bradford, who decided to test the market amongst urban African American populations in New York City for African American artists. After much negotiation, he convinced label head Fred Hagar to take a shot. Hagar, defying warnings from several white observers, arranged for the sessions for February 1920 to produce 2 sides for Mamie Smith, a 25-year veteran of vaudeville who was widely popular with both black and white audiences. But there was a caveat. Smith had to record 2 pop songs to test the marketplace. The record, That Thing Called Love, backed with You Can't Keep a Good Man Down, did well, and Hagar agreed to recording a blues song at an August session to be supervised by Peer. Bradford engaged an all-black band to back Smith and saw to the arrangements, and history was made. Crazy Blues is often thought to be the first blues record, but it isn't really. As Bradford had written it as a stage piece, it mixes 12-bar blue verses with 16-bar pop verses. It opens with a pop verse, then a blues, then a pop, then 2 blues, and a pop to close. The tempo is stately. But Smith, especially on the blues verses, which feature what are known as floating lyrics that float from song to song, very common in the blues. Ain't no change in the weather, ain't no change in the seas. Doctor's gonna call, do all that he can, but what you're gonna need is an Undertaker man. These have appeared in hundreds of songs in the last 100 years and probably appeared in 100 songs before that. Manages to wring genuine pathos from the song. She is clearly a skillful singer who brings all of her experience on stage to the piece. Clearly, within 3 years, Bessie Smith has made her style seem old-fashioned, but she should well be remembered for not just being an innovator, but a genuine talent in her own right. Unbeknownst to them then, history had been made. Like most early songs, an accurate record of sales is impossible beyond the initial catalogue run of a record, as hit records sold over many years. It's known the song sold 75,000 copies in its first 2 months, a huge hit by the standards of the day, and about 150,000 in 6 months, and by 1929, when it dropped out of the Okeh catalogue, probably due to the master physically wearing out, it's estimated that 1 million copies were sold. But as a landmark, it is priceless. The blues and all that was to spring from them had entered the classic canon. And in proving that regional music could sell, it sparked a mania for getting scouts out into rural and regional America, where they discovered more blues singers by 1922, the musicians who sowed the seed for folk music by 1924, the Piedmont blues by 1925, and thanks to Ralph Peer himself, country music and his epic Bristol sessions in 1927 that gave us the Carter Family and the great Jimmy Rogers. Mamie Smith had another 10 years in theatre, radio and films, giving a young Coleman Hawkins his first gig, but still died too young and penurious in 1946. Perry Bradford actually came out of the whole thing very much the worst. As he'd cobbled together a couple of his old stage songs to make Crazy Blues, the owners of the copyright on those songs sued him, and he lost all of his money that he made on the record. The Great Depression wiped out whatever stocks he had remaining, and he scuffled by for the rest of his life, best remembered by rock and roll fans for writing Keep a Knockin' for Little Richard. There was interesting popular music before the classic canon, no doubt, but to my mind the democratization and dominance of popular music, with that perfect confluence of the artists, the socio-economic circumstances of an increasingly affluent society, emerging technology and good old-fashioned entrepreneurial capitalism, which built that classic canon, all began on that August day in New York in 1920.